I told him I needed some air. That's what I said. I put on my coat. I nodded at my son-in-law's mother like I believed every word she just told me, and I walked out through the front door of that house into the cold November evening. Then I sat in my car for 45 seconds, and I drove back around the block and parked where they couldn't see me from the windows. I'm 63 years old. I spent 22 years as a county sheriff's deputy in Central Virginia before my knees gave out and I took early retirement. I know what a lie looks like. I know what it sounds like. I know the particular way a person's eyes move when they're telling you something they rehearsed. My daughter's mother-in-law had that look the entire time she was talking to me. Let me back up. My daughter, I'll call her my girl because that's how I think of her. That's how I've thought of her since the day she was born 31 years ago in a hospital not unlike the one I'm about to tell you about. She married a man named Spencer 3 years ago, Spencer Aldrich. His family had money, old money, the kind that makes people believe they're a different species than the rest of us. I never trusted Spencer, not because of the money. I've known plenty of wealthy people who are decent human beings. I didn't trust Spencer because of the way he spoke to my daughter when he thought I wasn't listening. Not cruel, not loud, just quietly dismissive. The way you'd correct a child who keeps making the same small mistake. My daughter is one of the smartest people I know. She has a master's degree in environmental science. She ran half marathons before her pregnancy slowed her down. She is not a woman who needs correcting. But she loved him, or she believed she did, and I kept my mouth shut because she was 30 years old and it was her life, and the last thing I wanted was to be the father who drove a wedge between his daughter and her husband and then got blamed for every problem in the marriage afterward. So I kept quiet. I watched. I stayed close. When she got pregnant, I was over the moon. She called me on a Tuesday morning, I remember, because I was on my back porch drinking coffee and watching a pair of cardinals fight over the feeder. And she said, "Dad, you're going to be a grandfather." I cried. I'm not ashamed of that. I sat on that porch for a long time after we hung up, and I just cried. Spencer's family threw a party, a big one. His mother, Loretta, rented out a room at the Aldrich Country Club and invited about 60 people I'd never met. I sat at a table with my brother and his wife and smiled for 4 hours. My daughter looked beautiful and tired and a little overwhelmed, and every time I caught her eye across the room, she gave me a look that said, I know. Just a little longer. The pregnancy was hard. She had complications early. Nothing catastrophic, her OB said, but enough to require extra monitoring. Spencer worked long hours. His mother inserted herself constantly, recommending her own doctors, sending articles about diet and exercise and the correct way to breathe during labor. I'd bit my tongue until it bled. In the last month, my daughter moved back in with me for 2 weeks, while Spencer was traveling for work. Those were the best 2 weeks I'd had in years. We watched old movies and I made her soup and she slept in her childhood bedroom, and for a little while it felt like things were simple again. She went back to their house in Charlottesville 10 days before her due date. The call came on a Thursday afternoon. Spencer's voice. He said there had been complications during delivery. He said the baby was healthy, but my daughter had. And here he paused in a way that felt practiced, hadn't made it. He said it was sudden. He said the doctors had done everything they could. I didn't say anything for a long moment. Then I said I was coming. He said I didn't need to rush, that there were things being handled, that his family was there and everything was being taken care of. That phrase, everything was being taken care of, that phrase, everything was being taken care of, lodged in my brain like a splinter. I drove to Charlottesville in just under 2 hours. I parked and went inside, and Spencer's mother met me in the lobby before I could get to the elevator. She was dressed like she was attending a luncheon. Her eyes were dry. She told me the same thing Spencer had told me on the phone in almost identical words. She said it had been peaceful. She said my daughter hadn't suffered. I asked to see her. Loretta said there were procedures. She said the hospital needed time. She said it would be better if I came back tomorrow. A grief-stricken man might have believed her. A man who hadn't spent 2 decades reading people for a living might have nodded and gone home. I told her I needed some air, and I left. And then I sat in my car and I thought about every single thing that had been wrong about that conversation. Loretta had not cried. Spencer had not been in the lobby. Nobody from the hospital staff had come to speak with me. And in every death notification I had ever witnessed, real or professional, the hospital always sent someone. A social worker, a chaplain, someone. There was none of that. I went back inside, not through the main entrance. I went around to the side entrance by the parking garage, the one I'd noticed when I pulled in. I took the stairs to the maternity floor. I'd asked Spencer weeks earlier which hospital, which floor, which doctor. I'd kept notes on my phone the way I used to keep notes in the field. The maternity ward at that hour was quiet. A nurse at the station looked up at me and I said my daughter had just delivered and I was her father and I'd gotten confused about the room. She checked her screen and told me the room number without hesitating. I walked down the hall. The door was partially open. My daughter was in that bed, pale, exhausted, oxygen sensor on her finger, IV in her arm, but breathing, awake. When she saw me in the doorway, her face did something I cannot fully describe even now. It collapsed and rebuilt itself in about 2 seconds. She said, "Dad," just that. I went in and closed the door and sat beside her and held her hand, and for a minute neither of us spoke. Then she told me everything. The delivery had been extremely difficult. There had been a hemorrhage, significant blood loss, and for a period of time, the situation was genuinely touch and go. The doctors had stabilized her. She was going to recover. The baby, my granddaughter, 6 pounds 4 ounces, was in the NICU as a precaution, but was expected to be fine. Spencer had been in the delivery room when things got critical. He had watched the medical team work, and at some point during that process, when the outcome was still uncertain, he had stepped into the hallway and called his mother. What happened next, my daughter learned from a nurse who'd overheard it. Spencer had told his mother that it wasn't looking good, and his mother had said, "I am going to try to say this as plainly as I can, because it deserves to be said plainly." His mother had said, "If she doesn't make it, make sure you have access to the accounts before anyone starts asking questions." The accounts. My daughter's accounts. She had a trust from her grandmother. Not an enormous sum, but meaningful. Around $400,000 that she'd managed conservatively for years. Spencer had been trying to get her to consolidate it into a joint account for 18 months. She'd resisted. I quietly encouraged that resistance without ever explaining why. By the time my daughter had stabilized and the doctors had confirmed she was out of danger, Spencer had apparently decided the story was easier if it just went the other way. He called me. He called his own relatives. He told people she hadn't made it. What he didn't know was that a nurse had been in the hallway. A woman named, I only know her first name, Denise, who had heard the phone call to Loretta and who, when Spencer started telling the ward staff a version of events that didn't match the medical record, had quietly flagged it to her charge nurse. That charge nurse was the one who came and found me as I was sitting with my daughter. She knocked softly and asked if she could speak with us. She explained what the staff had observed. She told us that the hospital had a legal obligation once they became aware of potential fraud, and that they had already contacted their patient advocate and legal department. She also told me, and she said this quietly, almost gently, that Spencer had been in the family waiting room down the hall making phone calls for the past 40 minutes, and that she thought I should know that before I decided what to do next. I excused myself. I stepped out into the hallway and I stood there for a moment. Then I called my brother, who was a retired judge in Roanoke. I told him what had happened in about 4 minutes. He told me to call a specific attorney, a woman he knew who handled exactly this kind of case. I called her. She answered on the second ring, even though it was past 7 in the evening. She told me not to let my daughter sign anything. She said she'd be there by 9. I walked down the hall to the waiting room. Spencer was sitting in a chair by the window with his phone to his ear. He looked up when I came in and something moved across his face. Surprise, then something else, something calculating, and he ended his call. He said, "Henry, I didn't know you were here." I said, "I'm sure you didn't." There was a long pause. He started to say something about the situation being complicated, about the hospital having given him confusing information, about how upset he was about everything that had happened. He was good at it. Smooth, practiced, the words coming out in the right order. I let him finish. Then I said, "My daughter is alive, Spencer. I just came from her room. I have seen a lot of things in my years of law enforcement. I've seen people caught in lies before. What I saw on that man's face in that waiting room is something I will not forget. It wasn't guilt, it was arithmetic. He was calculating right in front of me what the best next move was." He said, "I was going to tell you, I just found out she's stabilized." I said, "Don't." I went back to my daughter's room and I stayed there. The attorney arrived at 9:15. She was calm and efficient, and she asked my daughter a series of careful questions. She took notes. She explained what the next steps looked like. She also placed a call to a colleague who handled financial fraud and asset protection. And within the hour, my daughter's accounts had been flagged with her bank and a hold process initiated. Spencer was still in the building. His mother arrived around 10 o'clock. I don't know who called her. She tried to come to my daughter's room and the charge nurse turned her away. What followed over the next several months was not quick, and it was not easy. My daughter came home with my granddaughter, who I held for the first time in the hospital, and who looked at me with these enormous dark eyes like she'd already seen everything, and she stayed with me while she recovered. We converted my home office into a nursery. I built the crib myself, which took an entire Saturday afternoon and language I will not repeat here, but I built it. The legal process moved slowly. Spencer's attorney was expensive and aggressive and made several attempts to characterize the whole episode as a misunderstanding, as miscommunication during a medical crisis, as anything other than what it was. The hospital's documentation was thorough. Denise, the nurse who'd first flagged the situation, gave a statement. 2 other staff members who had witnessed Spencer's conduct that evening also gave statements. The financial fraud case was handled separately. The evidence of Spencer's intent, text messages to his mother, a conversation with a financial advisor that had been recorded, emails, was more than sufficient. His attorney eventually stopped fighting quite so hard. Spencer pled guilty to fraud and filing a false death report. He served 8 months. His mother, Loretta, was charged as an accessory and received probation and a fine, which felt insufficient to me but was the prosecutor's call, not mine. My daughter filed for divorce before he entered his plea. It was finalized the following spring. She's doing well, better than well. She went back to her work in environmental consulting last fall, mostly remote so she can be home with my granddaughter. She runs again. Not half marathons yet, but she's working up to it. She has good friends who showed up for her. She has her faith, which she has always been quiet about, but which I think carried her through the hardest weeks. My granddaughter is 2 years old now. She has her mother's eyes and her great-grandmother's stubbornness, and she calls me Pop Pop. Wait, no, she can't call me that. That's already spoken for in this family, I suppose. She calls me Grandpa Henry. She says it like it's one word, Grandpa Henry. She runs at me when I come through the door with her arms out and her whole face lit up, and I catch her every time, and I think that is the whole point. That is what all of it was for. I was asked once, by a younger man at my church who knew some of what had happened, whether I regretted keeping quiet for so long. Whether I should have intervened earlier, pushed harder, said what I saw. I've thought about that question more times than I can count. Here's what I've come to. You can see trouble coming and still not be able to stop it from arriving. What you can do is stay close enough that when it arrives, you're already there. You don't walk away. You sit in the parking lot. You go back through the side door. You hold your daughter's hand and you make the calls and you do not leave. That's the only wisdom I have. Stay. Don't leave. Whatever you're facing tonight, whoever you're worried about, stay close. That's where you need to be. I keep coming back to the moment I sat in that parking lot, engine off, hands in my lap, deciding. It would have been easy to drive home. Grief does that. It offers you an exit, a reason to stop pushing, a way to tell yourself you did what you could. I almost took it. I won't pretend otherwise. For about 45 seconds, I almost just drove away. But something in me knew, not supernaturally, not some vision or sign, just the slow, accumulated knowledge of having watched people lie for 22 years. The way Loretta's eyes were dry, the way Spencer's words came out in the wrong order, the way nobody from the hospital had come to speak with me. My mind had been doing the math without telling me, and when I finally sat still long enough to listen, the answer was already there. That's the thing about paying attention. It costs you something. It's uncomfortable, and it's slow, and sometimes you spend years watching a situation you cannot fix yet. I watched Spencer for 3 years. I saw what he was. I stayed quiet because my daughter was an adult, and it wasn't my call. I have made peace with that mostly, but I never stopped watching, and when the moment came that required me to act, I was ready. Not because I'm exceptional, but because I hadn't let myself go numb. Spencer and Loretta made a fundamental miscalculation. They assumed that because I was grieving, I was also helpless. They assumed that emotion and clarity are opposites. In my experience, they are not. The clearest I have ever thought in my life was in that parking lot, in the quiet, with everything stripped away. Grief, real grief, has a way of burning off everything that isn't essential. What was left in me that night was just the knowledge that my daughter needed her father and I was the only one who was going to go back through that door. What happened to Spencer was not luck, and it was not fate. It was consequence. He made choices, deliberate, calculating, greedy choices, and those choices left a trail. Text messages, a recorded conversation, staff members who saw what he did and were willing to say so. The world is not always just, but it keeps better records than people like Spencer tend to believe. And my daughter, I think about what it took for her to survive that year. Not just the physical recovery, which was its own hard road, but everything after. The legal process, the divorce, rebuilding her life with an infant and a body still healing. She could have collapsed under any one of those things. She didn't. That is not something that happened to her. That is something she decided, day after day, in ways that most people will never see. My granddaughter runs at me with her arms out every time I come through the door. She doesn't know any of this yet. One day she will, or some version of it. And I hope what she takes from it is not the cruelty of what was done to her mother, but the clarity of what her mother chose to do in response. Stay close to the people you love. Pay attention even when it's inconvenient. And when you're sitting in that parking lot deciding, go back through the door.